I do draw all the time, and I draw, and a lot of the things I draw are either whimsical or fantastic. And I found, in most meetings, I spend a lot of time drawing, and it just happened that fantasy themes kept arising. So the desire to kind of maybe design a game for my kids and have something that they could play.
Hi, welcome to the Dieku podcast. I'm Gary Snow, and with me is Matthew Carlson, the designer and creator of WanderSquares. Matthew, welcome.
Hey everybody, how are you?
Well, I just have to say that I watch Kickstarters all the time, and this one just jumped out at me for the creativity and the artistic impression that I got from it. And I just fell in love with the project personally. I thought it was amazing. I thought you did an amazing job on it. And I was really happy that you agreed to be here with me today to share your process of how you developed WanderSquares.
I'm happy to talk about it, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm really happy to be here and share everything I can about the process and how it all came about.
Great. I guess the first question is, how did you kind of get into this realm of being a game designer in the first place? Is this something you always wanted to do? How did you get into role playing?
So I got into role playing very early. I'm a kid of the '80s, so like many of us, I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons and Top Secret and Boot Hill and Gamma World and pretty much every old school TSR role playing game that I could. We lived pretty close to a game store, and it was probably my favorite place in the world. And I did that. That went on through grade school, through junior high, and then I dropped off. And I kind of pulled, my gaming crew went apart. We all went our separate ways, went off to college. And I always sort of wanted to get back to that. I mean, the bottom line is that I feel like that was the most creative time in my life, like drawing maps, making characters, just drawing all the time, using my imagination, really kind of immersing myself in that. And that's something that actually I really wanted my kids to have. And so part of WanderSquares and the whole motivation behind it was bringing my kids into that experience of creating games, role playing, because I also see that sort of from my work life. So I'm a design director at a tech company. In my work life, I see a lot of people. There's a lot of engineers and a lot of designers, and a lot of people who played Dungeons and Dragons when they were kids, or who play Dungeons and Dragons now. And I think it's just or other role playing games. I've always just found it as this big central game design as being kind of being something that helps them really succeed, and me really succeed in my work as well. So I kind of wanted my kids to have it. I wanted my kids to have that fun experience.
That's great. And then I've noted on your Kickstarter and in other interviews you talked about your doodling, and how did that. We'll get into maybe the process of how that doodle becomes a game, but when you started to doodle and you went, at what point did you go, oh, this could be a game?
Yeah, so I do draw all the time, and I draw, and a lot of the things I draw are either whimsical or fantastic. And I found, in most meetings, I spend a lot of time drawing, and it just happened that fantasy themes kept arising. So the desire to kind of maybe design a game for my kids and have something that they could play, as well as a desire to sort of focus my doodling experience. And we talked about it a little bit before the interview, but I have a really hard time focusing my artistic skills and finding one style or one thing that I wanted to do. And I thought hey, let's try and make this game. Let's make that the focus. Let's really dive into that. And that's what allowed me to really, so that was another central thing. I wanted all this output and all this drawing that I was doing and all these notebooks to have a purpose. And this was that was the purpose.
Well, let's dive in and actually look at what WanderSquares is, and just kind of walk us through this process of WanderSquares itself and kind of the setting that you've created.
Sure, I'm happy to. So WanderSquares at its core is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game. It's really aiming towards kids 9 to 12 or new players, people who haven't really who want to kind of find that easy entry point into the role-playing experience. And that was the core behind it. So I wanted to design something that was going to be fun, quick, simple, something that might not be played out in a month-long or year-long campaign, but could really be played in a night. And another thing behind it is I wanted to, because I'm designing for new players, I really wanted it to be able to guide the players towards their actions, or towards the either the actions they're going to take, or and also help a new game master, or in this it's called storyteller. Wanted to help guide them through the experience too, because a lot of modern role-playing games are daunting. It's a huge number of books. I mean, I've got some of the stacks behind me, like about like 5 or 6 or 7 rule books and adventure books, and then on top of that, they need to completely ad-lib their experience. I wanted to create some guardrails that would help kids who wanted to get into role playing, or new players who wanted to get into role playing. I wanted to give them kind of a few things, so that it was more basically WanderSquares merges a lot of things of fantasy role playing, fantasy tabletop role playing, along with a choose your path book. So it really allows them to like, oh, here's some actions you can take. They're not forced to just like completely freewheel it. And then for the storyteller, they have some guidance too. They're given some really clear actions and outcomes. So once the players choose one direction, then they have like, oh, here's what happens. They don't have to look up a lot of stats. They can really just like flow straight into the action and the outcome of what comes next. So those were some of the things that I was thinking of from the very beginning, that I wanted to create something that was easy, fun, quick. And that would be that perfect first role-playing game, as it were. And I also knew that I wanted to, like, just like some of the old school role-playing games that I grew up with, I knew that I wanted to have multiple adventures, not just one-off, but have it be like part of a big sequence. So the first WanderSquares adventure is one of 3 that all take place in an environment called the Winding Wood, and they're all a linked story. So at the end of the first one, it kind of dovetails into the second, which will dovetail into the third. And you're looking at, so here's the map of that environment with that.
And so here, explain kind of the way the card system works for you.
Yeah, so the cards, the adventure squares, you get the core of the game is this deck of 32 adventure squares. And each adventure square is its own little story with actions and outcomes and kind of creatures or treasure. And the players come into this, and then they basically come into this, they hear the description of the square, they choose an action, there's outcomes. Sometimes it can be lead to a battle. Sometimes it's talking and finding out information, or exploring the square for treasure. And then after that, they choose the next square and it gets put down at random. So the whole map starts from this central square and grows out in kind of from a shuffled deck of other squares until like it starts really building the entire map.
And then you developed, with the board, you developed these little stand-ups, little icons in the characters.
Yeah. So all the characters, and there's 16 characters that you can choose. And I'll go into why I actually brought these characters along. In a very early playtest, I had my kids make their own characters, and it took an hour, and then that was it. That was the playtest. We didn't even get through to the game. And so one thing I did in the for the final version is created 16 characters. There's 4 different classes, 4 different kinds, as we call them in the game. There's a really broad variety. And I wanted to do everything in a way that would make it really easy to be kind of like, I wanted the game box itself to be kind of small, portable, easy to take with you. And that's why I went towards this like stand-ups instead of going with kind of a figurine route. I wanted everything to be really compact. So it'd be easy to, take it off to middle school, carry it around with you, take it on a trip.
And one of the questions I had for you is, so with the card system, you basically almost need a box set in order to share it. But at any point, did you ever go, well, that's a big leap to go from like a book or a pamphlet, like or a zine, to a box set? I mean, that's the premise of the game, is the cards.
Yeah.
But that must have been quite a leap of faith when you started thinking about, oh, am I ready for a box set?
Yeah, I think I always knew it needs some type of container to carry all these parts and pieces, because there's adventure squares, there's treasure cards, there's these booklets, there's dice. The reason why I think we needed the box set is mostly to hold those adventure squares, because they're the core of it. And basically, when you think of that, it's really a visual map. So unlike a map where you have to describe everything that's happening in the scene, I really wanted it to have something where that square gets set down. It's telling a story before the characters even hear anything. And then the book really complements it. Yeah, I'm not sure if I could have done it as just a zine. maybe in the
Yeah,
future.
well, the concept itself doesn't lend itself to a book, but right out of the chute, you're, your first design, your first game, and you're like, I'm going for a box set, which is
Yeah,
pretty
there's a lot of
brave that
parts
you
and
did it.
pieces. Well, I mean, I think the flip side, which we'll get into, it took a long time. Like this was like a 5-year project, and it started really rough and evolved into this. So the one thing I gave myself I let myself have a lot of time to finish this. And and you'll see later when we talk through some of the prototype, these things really built on each other. So by the time I actually got to the Kickstarter, I'd already created a version of the game like almost complete about a year before, just to be able to try it out.
And if the kids want to make their own squares, they can actually, you've got the templates for them to design their own and add to the system. So it's not locked in. They can do what they need to do to keep adventuring.
Yeah, I made that. So if you want to invent your own ending, I added that to it. I really want kids to be able to either create their own adventures, and my kids have created a bunch of adventures using these. And I also made it. This was like a free download. I think a big part of what I wanted to do is I'm so thankful that Kickstarter that was successful. Even if it failed, I would have done all this too, because my overarching goal here is to make role playing and creation of role playing way more accessible. So that's why, as much as with all the stuff that could be purchased in the Kickstarter, I want to have tons of free downloads so people could create their own adventures. And that's one thing I think I'm going to lean into more.
And you talked about the characters, and we have some images here of the characters and their character sheets. And just maybe tell us about the classes that you chose and kind of why you chose them.
Okay. So the classes, there are knights, wizards, tricksters, and scouts are the thanks. Perfect. Those are the 4 classes. And so basically I wanted to let people be able to play in whatever role they wanted to play, but I also wanted to keep it really simple. Like I didn't want the system itself to be overwhelming. So there's only 4 classes. There's not like 16 or 17. And then there's 4 kinds. And the 4 kinds are humans, elves, gnomes, and fairies. And gnomes kind of stand in for dwarfs in my universe as well. So, but I added fairies because that felt like something that was new that hadn't really been done before and would have a little bit more whimsy. So here's an elf and a fairy. And then the reason I created 16 characters for the first game is I really wanted people to be able to, I wanted kids, whoever they are, to be able to see themselves in these pictures, to be able to find one of these characters that either like, hey, that looks like me, or that looks like something I want to be, or that resonates with me. And that's why I created a pretty broad set.
Well, just great. And then when you originally started, we have some doodles here that or notes that for your inspiration, and you talked about the whimsy of your design and all those things that you mentioned there: Dungeons and Dragons, Zelda, Adventure Time, and like they all really shine through on this. Like if I was a kid, I would absolutely love to explore this little world.
Yeah, I mean, these are all the favorite things from that I love to watch and the books I love to read, and certainly my kids as well. And so I wanted to make something that would seem inspiring, really magical, like incredibly imaginative, but not too scary. Because that's one thing. Like I wanted to make sure that like this first experience isn't something that players would walk away feeling dark or terrified. It's definitely more towards the whimsical. If I had to like mash it up, it is that sort of Dungeons and Dragons, Adventure Time, Spirited Away combo that I'm trying to go for in everything that I create here.
At any point, did you kind of question the target audience as far as like it's obviously meant for kids, but the people that are actually purchasing it are going to be the parents? And how did you kind of reconcile that?
Well, I mean, a lot of it I think is appealing to nostalgia. Like this is something that I would, if I hadn't made it, I would definitely go and buy it off Kickstarter for my kids. But I hope that in like everything, I tried to expose as much of the game as possible on the Kickstarter and on my website so that parents could come in and really get a good sense of it and the purpose of the game and understand what it's for.
And your artistic process, because I mean, that is for me, everything is great about the game, but your art is really what sells it for me. It's just it hits that sweet spot of the, as you described, like the Adventure Time and like that kind of whimsy and Wizard of Oz and all those types of things put together for kids. I'm actually going to pitch to you that you should do a children's book, because like this is like incredible artwork. But can you just tell us how you go from your doodle to the finished product?
Yeah, and I should share right off the bat. I've pitched children's books a lot and had tons and tons of rejections. So that's one thing why I'm kind of a fan of Kickstarter, is this a chance to just like, okay, let me put it out straight to the public and see if people would like this. And yeah, I definitely imagine I think there's going to be more and more story elements coming out through the course of this. But like one thing, the reason why everything in this is as modular as it is I don't feel a great degree of confidence as a writer, but I feel like I can write a square. I can write a tiny adventure that happens in a tiny square and have that really resonate. So this format really lent itself to feeling like, hey, this is something I can do. And it was also something that I could chop off and do like in little pieces of time, like on the ferry or on the commute, or, late at night or early in the morning, just like, draw one square, write one little chunk of adventure, and then gradually over time it built into the fuller book.
And the names that you've come up with, I mean, they're quite charming. The Box Knight and
yeah, and that is a bad guy that you will meet probably at the end of the third adventure, and you will not want to meet them. So that is an agent of there's a big bad guy floating out in the universe that is sort of behind all this disruption that's happening on all these different magical worlds, and you will not be ready to meet that person until a long time, but certainly not at the end of the first three adventures.
Yeah. And so what software do you use to get your images to this stage?
Yeah, so I used, a lot of what you're seeing is a lot of this started with hand drawings, actually. Almost everything starts with a doodle in a notebook where I capture the ideas. But then I used at first I used a program called Procreate, and now I use a program. Almost everything that you can see in the later work or in all the future work is all in Adobe Fresco. So I'm drawing the squares, this next set of squares, and all the artwork is more and more in Adobe Fresco. So I would, go ahead.
Well, is there certain brushes that you use? Like, is it watercolor, or do you do like line art and then do the lines a little thicker and just kind of go from there?
I think first I use some big fat chalk brush and map out major shapes and try and kind of get a composition going. And perfect example. So here, the very first pass is I'm just blocking stuff out with whatever broad stroke brush I can find, and then I sketch over and over and over. And I use the ability within programs like this to kind of like to work in layers and keep building up until I probably sketch over each one of these. I probably sketched over 4 or 5 times, starting with a really ugly rough sketch, and then moving things around, refining things, getting the everything kind of in its right place. And then I'll do a final drawing and then color it in and then shade it in. And by that time, by the end of it, once I'm dropping in the final colors, it's pretty easy at that point because I've blocked out all the major shapes. But the most painstaking part of the process, I think, is getting the composition straight and then just doing the kind of black and white line work that you're seeing here.
And how much does each one of these images, as far as time commitment, take for you, do you think, if you had to ballpark it?
I would say each one and because I'm slow, I'm not an illustrator by trade, this is still my hobby. Each one of these probably took a week because I'm not doing it full time. I'm doing it because it's late night or early morning time.
But if you calculated the total hours of to get to a final one, an hour or 2 hours,
I think each one of these is probably an 8-hour drawing.
Wow. Yeah. Well, beautiful stuff. And this one I mentioned to you that I really, really like. It's got an essence to it. But you said this is one of your earliest drawings, right?
Yeah, and I think I think I'm always learning as a illustrator, and I'm way at the beginning of my process as a game designer. But I was trying to teach myself how to draw backgrounds. And here I just traced off some cliffs in Iceland. I wanted this to be a cold place, but I did kind of traced off some shapes from a cliffs in Iceland, and then just brushed over it with these big ink roller brushes to create this a little bit of the texture. And then I wanted this ominous, weird teardrop ice monster in the front with a tiny boat. Like I wanted this to really be kind of like a brooding, ominous picture, and I think I succeeded. But this was just experiments to really get better at drawing backgrounds.
Yeah. And so you got this incredible art and this really good idea for the game, and you went to the process of playtesting, which not everybody does, but how important was the playtesting to the final product, and what was the methodology behind that?
I mean, my methodology was using my captive playtesters to work through as much of the early stages as possible. So I put my kids and my wonderful wife through about 3 playtests of this. And I think what you're looking at right now, this is the second one. This was the playtest where everything got gobbled up by creating the player characters. You can see my daughter there busily working away at her characters, and she got more immersed in that in the game. So I think we played maybe half of the game and didn't quite solve the adventure that time. But and my kids, I mean, a lot of this was my selfish attempt as a parent to keep my kids involved in art. We used to do these family drawings all the time, and I wanted this game to be something that we could all work on together, and we all did. So it was fun. A lot of these early stages, they're really contributing to it. But I learned a lot through the playtests about after that playtest, I'm like, okay, I need to pre-make the characters and just bake that in so people can just pick it up and go. Because otherwise a kid is going to face so many choices and they might not even get to the game if they have to make their own character beforehand. So after that first playtest, okay, I'm making the characters and I'm going to let them take command. And then, but I also, and now you're seeing some of the rough cards from the early stage. At every point, I wanted to keep everything as rough as possible in the early stages. So everything was like hand drawn, ballpoint on paper for a really long time. On these decks of cards. I think I got them from Paper Source or something like that. And because I wanted to be able to swap out things. I wanted everything on this to be like, hey, that's not working. I can swap that out with a different card. Or hey, that adventure square isn't quite perfect yet. I want to change the story, because I'm still learning a lot as a game designer. I would say I'm at the beginning of my journey. I wanted to make sure that all the parts and pieces here were things that I could easily change out. So I wouldn't get too locked into one magic card or one adventure square or one story. I wanted to have everything be really modular.
Well, and then here's really good picture of your family playing the game, and that must have been I'm guessing during the COVID lockdowns and that kind of thing. It was probably a really good family activity.
Yeah, this was right before. So we had one quick getaway up to a Lake Tahoe, and we played the game in its full glory for the first time at that. And they flip to the next picture, and you kind of see the squares unfolding. And this was when the game, I think, was in its clearest form. And then the one nice thing about it is this is where I started learning a lot about. After this game, I realized a couple things. But the biggest thing here is the battles went too slowly. So after this playtest, when we were actually trying everything out, getting through the squares, and we got through the entire game all through to completion and played it all out, and it took a decent amount of squares. They were able to enjoy a lot of the adventure before we got to the end. But the one thing I realized is that the process of battles was slowing down the whole adventure. And so I wanted this to be super simple. And so after that last playtest, I really changed the structure towards battles to simplify it to its current state.
And not necessarily part of the playtest, but as part of your overall process, just like your squares that you give the kids a chance to actually design their own squares, I thought it was a really good touch to add, draw your own monsters, characters, and you actually teaching them your doodling process.
Yeah, and the first thing you showed before that showed all of the monsters together. Yeah, I wanted the kids to be able to go oh, if I needed to make an adventure, I need to borrow some monsters. Here's some good thought starters. So I wanted them to be able to either print it out and trim them out, or look at those as some things that we could draw off of. So I really try and go with basic shapes and things that would be easy for a kid to draw. I think that's one other theme with the maps, with everything else. I want to try and do it in a way where a kid could look at that and say hey, I could do that. And then this is totally borrowing from one of my favorite artists that there's an artist named Ed Emberley, that is like really, that teaches kids how to draw things out of simple shapes. And so I wanted to have one part of that be in this as well. So you can like pick your shape, pick your ornaments, pick your eyes, mouths, and suddenly you've got a monster.
Well, that's great. And here's a shot of some of the squares in full bloom on the table. And
yeah, and it's been really interesting. So everything starts at that square in the middle, that 0, 1, but then it can go in any direction. And so it's good to play this game on a really wide table. That's the one bit of advice I'd have, because like it starts to spread out. And hopefully you have kids or players who don't just try and go in a single line, but do like sort of circling around a little bit. But yeah, so the way the game plays is there's 3 squares that are like the big bosses, that once you find those, then that unlocks the final square and you can win the adventure. But they could come at any point in the deck. And then and every time you get one of them, so here you can see, I think this is from one of our first play tests, but it's always interesting to watch the way that the map grows, how soon they find one of those first major squares. And then when you find the first major square, if there's a portal opens up that allows you to sort of shortcut Zelda style back to any other portal or to the first square. And so then you've got these ways to jump around the adventure and jump around the map. But it's different for every player, every time. The map takes a different sort of form.
And so you've done the play testing, and now you're like, okay, I got to get it to market or Kickstarter.
Yeah.
What was that process like? And even the timing of it, I couldn't help but notice it was like right before Christmas holidays.
I made so many bad choices. I think that the reason why I did the Kickstarter when I did is, it was that year when we really saw a global pandemic bloom. And I was going to try and go the route. The reason why I developed the game to the extent that it did is I was really hoping to start going to conferences and trying it out and demoing it with other players. And then I'm like, okay. And then at the end of the year in the fall, hopefully doing my Kickstarter. But then, the world crashed to a halt. And I'd worked so long on this that I really wanted to get it out there. And so I just picked that date. I said, we're going to roll this out in October. And it was, we're in the US. It was the craziest election that we've ever had, in the middle of a pandemic, right before Halloween. And I'll just say I could have made better choices. But so that was and out there, if you're going to start a Kickstarter, don't make those mistakes. That was pretty funny. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, what kind of, in the tiers that you chose and the pricing that you chose, and I mean, some designers can learn from your Kickstarter and your process and your design choices, as far as like, how did you set the price, and were you confident in it, and your goals and your targets, and what factors went into making those decisions?
Yeah, it was, this was my first Kickstarter, and really, and I went purposely small. I just wanted to basically print 500 boxes was my goal, which is not a huge goal. And I wanted to, because it was my first Kickstarter, I wanted to be conservative. And I think one of the main things that I strove for, which I did, is I wanted to cover my printing costs. So I did one, unlike a lot of Kickstarters where if you're printing figurines or really complex boards, or if your game is a very complex game, you're most likely printing it in China, and which adds another level of time, risk, everything to the equation. I made the decision to try to work with local printers in North America to try and mitigate that risk a little bit. And so consequently, one aspect of that is like the game is more expensive than it could have been had I gone a different route or printed it all in China. But I was able to do a slightly better job of controlling my time and when I was going to get all the materials, and control the process a little bit more. But I set the price based on what it would cost to print the material, print the booklets, the squares, the boxes. And then it only uses 6-sided dice. So I didn't have like a really special crazy dice that I was choosing. And that was purposeful as well. So really I set my costs based on what it would cost to get this adventure out. I'm still in the midst of boxing up some of the sets that didn't sell during the adventure and selling those off and trying to make sure I make a profit that way. I haven't made a big significant. This is my first Kickstarter. My goal is just like, can I just like not have a loss? Like that was my goal. Get this out there, get this game out there, and it's my first game, and and do okay, which we did.
Well, I thought it was really well done, and I really enjoyed your marketing. And like, I would see your posts on Instagram every day, and I'd like them. And
Yeah.
I just, like I said, I fell in love with the artwork and the whimsy of the whole story, and I was a backer myself, so I
Thank you
thought
so
it was
much.
really, really well done. And but you got, as we kind of alluded to earlier, you got pretty close. You got it funded in 26 days of the
Yeah.
30. And do you kind of go, wow, what would have happened if I had done things differently or set different goals, or?
Yeah, I think here's one of the big, I talked about all the mistakes I made, but one of the biggest mistakes I made was not delving deeper into some of the different communities and groups out there that were probably a huge chunk of my audience that I hadn't met yet. So once you start the Kickstarter, suddenly I found out about like 5 different Facebook groups that are all about like tabletop gaming or game design or game marketing. That suddenly I dove into those and met a lot of people who I should have met about 2 months earlier. So like in an ideal world, what I would have done is worked with content creators like yourself, worked with game reviewers, got the game out there in people's hands so that they could review it and build awareness for the game before I jumped into the Kickstarter. And I did that as I was running the Kickstarter, but it got pretty close. Like, yes, it funded in the 26 day, but it could have not funded.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy that I didn't go down to the wire.
Well, and then I guess the other things that I'd probably ask you is like, what advice besides those would you give to designers, as far as like, it's often a big leap to get to this point where you actually have a game to pitch or sell. And did you ever at any point kind of go, boy, this is too big for me?
I think the only reason that I didn't, the thing that gave me confidence is that I had been working on this for so long, and that every person who touched one of the prototypes or saw some of the early art was like, oh, you should really do something with this. So I had enough cheerleaders who were kind of backing me on to figure out, hey, I do really need to do something with this, and I do need to launch it. And the time that I chose to launch it was a little rough, but it worked, and it was better than waiting any longer. 5 games, I think 5 years is like that's time enough to get ready to launch. I had a lot of good feedback along the way that gave me confidence.
That's
Also,
great.
the only other thing being there is like there's also a gap in the market, and part of what I was looking at is like there's so like serious, super complex games on Kickstarter, and then there's things like Dungeons and Dragons that are incredible, like so robust, but nothing was really being made for kids. Nothing was really being made to kind of introduce kids into the hobby, and I wanted to create that. So I thought there was like an open gap that I could try and fill.
And so next steps for you, let me bring up the Golden Hive on the screen here. So this is your second adventure. Is it going to Kickstarter, or what's your plans for it?
I'm definitely going to go to Kickstarter, and I'm trying to pick my date. It's either going to be probably February, late February or mid-March. I'm thinking for the launch of this one. I've got the adventure, a lot of the art done. I've got kind of an outline of the different squares, and I'm like chipping away at the squares bit by bit. But basically, the second one still takes place in the Winding Wood. It's a case of sibling rivalry and invasion and sort of happening all within this massive beehive that sits on top of a oak that is like the tallest tree in the forest. And you're going to go in there to understand who invaded, what happened, and to try and kind of bring the queen back to her throne. That's the goal of this one. And once again, you're playing the wander kind, which are sort of these wandering do-gooders who are coming in to try and like restore balance and order. And this they're going to kind of dive and climb up into the Golden Hive and try and right all the wrongs and figure out what mystery is happening there. But I'm in the process of drawing those right now.
And are they going to be in another box set now that you've got that down pat?
The primary part of it is going to be another set of 32 squares, 32 kind of treasure cards, and another booklet. But it won't have the players. It'll just be like, as I do these further adventures, I'm hoping to make them cheaper and more accessible, because they won't also have the players, the 16 players, and the players and the the player's guide. They're really just going to be just the pure adventure this time.
And if somebody wanted to get the original WanderSquares box set, can they still do that? Can they still buy it from you?
I do have, I'm going to be setting up a web store really in December to sell the remaining squares from the first Kickstarter, but then I'm going to do a reprint or a second edition that will go along with the next adventure. So if you missed WanderSquares on the first Kickstarter, you can buy the Golden Hive and buy the first adventure. You can buy basically both box sets is my goal.
Well, it all sounds really good, and I'm excited to see the next iteration of it and the next adventure. And like I said, I'm just smitten with your artwork. I think it's fantastic. Everybody that sees it, I think, just loves it. And so I can't wait to see the next versions of it. And then I'll make sure that all the notes to your website and your old Kickstarter, and so that they can follow you for the new Kickstarter, are available on the notes. But once again, I just want to thank you for joining me today, and I really appreciate you sharing your process. And I think it's a good learning story for a lot of designers out there, and I wish you the best of luck in the future.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me on. This has been great.